everything you're doing for a long period of time is essentially practice. And I think a lot of the time that long-term foresight kind of gets lost in the process, especially with younger athletes or people who are earlier on. Everyone wants it now. Everyone wants to qualify for this thing now, or snatch this or clean and jerk this now. But it's at what expense to what you're really trying to accomplish? You find out in the long run.
Hey, it's Ben Wise, and this is The Fitness Movement. The Fitness Movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. Zor Fitness is my company and my platform to deliver training content to coaches and athletes like you. The site has educational resources on everything from program design and exercise physiology to skill progressions and movement breakdowns. And in terms of programming, we have our online training program, The Protocol, and I also offer one-on-one remote coaching. It's all at one place, zorfitness.com. Today we have Kyle Fields on the show. He is the owner of 1440 Athletics, which is home of CrossFit 717. And for those of you who have been listening for a little bit, that might sound familiar. I actually interviewed the head coach from 1440, which is Jeff Baltimore. And that was actually the first interview ever of the Fitness Movement, which was episode 22, because the first season was all solo rants. So I actually went there. That was my first affiliate that I was ever a member of. So it's always going to hold a special place in my heart. And today I get to sit down with Kyle, the owner of 1440 and also of the 1440 Collective. This is a USA weightlifting club that their main location is out of the same facility that CrossFit 717 is located in. So most of the athletes are competing in weightlifting, in other words, snatch and clean and jerk. However, a lot of them are also concerned about CrossFit performance or just about upping their numbers as a whole. And that's really what we dive into today. So you can follow 1440 on socials at 1440 Strength, at 1440 Athletics. And for both of those, 1440 is actually spelled out. And you can follow Kyle at kfields_11. Specifically today, we get into the impact of in-person coaching in a weightlifting meet versus at a CrossFit competition. And that's often a theme that you'll see in this conversation, is that Kyle kind of takes the weightlifting perspective because that's mainly what he coaches. I'm mainly coach CrossFitters, so I kind of gear things that direction. Obviously, weightlifting and training and strength development is obviously a huge important component of both those sports. So it's something that we get into more. We also talk about programming frequency for snatches, cleans, jerks, and other accessory movements, since an accessory in weightlifting is going to be considered anything other than snatch and clean jerk. We also talk about the order of lifts in a session and movements that we often see pairing well together, for example, snatches and pulls. We also get into gender differences in programming. And then we end talking about the intangibles of what makes a great athlete. This was a great conversation. I personally learned a lot, and I know you guys are too. So without further ado, let's get into this conversation with Kyle Fields. Kyle, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, man. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So you are the head coach at 1440 Collective, which is a weightlifting club. You guys are part of USA Weightlifting. And you recently had a bunch of athletes compete at the Arnold in that meet. Mm-hmm. How many did you have there again?
It was 26.
Holy cow. So how many of them were actually coached directly by you?
So it all kind of falls under my name, but we have a handful of coaches that all coach for the team. Of the 26 that were there, it was probably somewhere around half or a little bit of half are listed as coach one of me is the correct term for it, I guess. But it's really a collaborative effort between all the coaches.
So did that mean that you were like running around the different platforms if you had different athletes lifting different places, or did you just kind of sit somewhere and then have another coach kind of take over if needed?
I was running around nonstop. I mean, it's that event was a 6-platform event, which was the first time. Usually these are like 2 platform, 3 platforms.
Like 2 or 3. 6 is a crazy amount.
So we had one session where there was 4 lifters lifting at one time on 3 different platforms on opposite ends of the building. So I was a little hectic.
Yeah, for sure. Running around. So I compare everything to CrossFit because that's what I coach, right? So it's like I'm imagining, like I'm thinking about how much of a game day impact you really have as a coach. And in CrossFit, when I was coaching at the games with my master's athlete, I was like running around, and like you don't really have a ton of impact. I feel like with weightlifting, you probably have a little bit more. Like I think it probably is case by case scenarios still, where like, if you have to make a big jump or something and like someone's in contention and they can possibly lift that, you might be able to do that. But how much of like a game day impact do you feel like coaching has in weightlifting?
So I'll kind of compare the two for you because there's a lot of similarities. Both of them are similar in that there's most of the time at least a loosely predetermined game plan.
Right.
At the games, you have a singular workout. In that workout, there's a game plan. Weightlifting has, for most people in a competition, some type of predetermined game plan, but it's like a really 50-50 split on how that game plan gets executed. So the athlete has to execute physically on what that game plan is going to look like, but the coach is really executing on everything that happens up until that first attempt is taken, timing warm-ups, all that kind of stuff. And then some of the jockeying and strategery that goes on
right
during the process for that 2 hours long is the coach. So it's a very symbiotic relationship.
So do you have like listed out ahead of time, like, hey, this is like a surefire number that I'm pretty sure that they can hit like, 8 out of 10 times or something. And then it's like, hey, this is if we have to make a jump, this is sort of our ceiling of what we think maybe we could jump to. How does that work? Do you have like a system for that? What does that look like?
Yeah. So the easiest answer is it depends. And it really depends on who the athlete is and what they're lifting for. And the Arnold was a good example for that. So on one end of the spectrum, you have someone who's trying to put themselves on Team USA, and there's 19 different things that have to be considered in doing that. In that scenario, you're going after this very specific total that you believe is going to put you ranked high enough for that team. And then on a level down from that, you're maybe playing in medal contention and you have this planned opener. But even that's minorly adjusted to put you in a position to medal. On the far end of the spectrum, you have someone who's, we had someone who was 13 years old doing their first large event. And in that, it's kind of irrelevant what everyone else is doing. You're really there to just build confidence in an athlete and get them exposed to something like that. So for that, you really have this really written out, just predetermined plan. We're going to do this really confident opener. Maybe that's like 85% of what they've done in training. And then, you're taking small jumps from there and you're only ending at, 90, 93%. So it's a wide span of what it looks like, but the Arnold was a good example of that.
Yeah. It's really like a case by case basis where it's like, you might be able to formulate a very specific game plan of like, this is the numbers that we know you have to hit to qualify for X event that you want to get to. It's a pretty straightforward plan in terms of how you
like you don't have a choice. Like there's events where you're going and the intention is to just lift the most that you possibly can for like a PR total or something like that. Or we want to set ourselves up to take a PR attempt on the competition platform. In other scenarios, we're really overreaching for something. You're kind of putting like this, go make a confident opener and then whatever it takes.
Yeah. I guess the scenario of it like being like, wait, we're going to have to really play this by ear to figure out how we can get you on the podium is probably actually a pretty rare scenario that actually happens.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, if you think about it, there's, for men and women, there's 20 A sessions that happen at an event, 10 women, 10 men. Of those A sessions, in each A session, you maybe have 5 athletes that are in contention really for medal positions. So And then, so it's like a numbers game at that point of how many athletes do you really have that are going to be in that scenario? It's few.
Yeah. And at a certain point, it's also like, you only get to sort of play those games if you have the strength to back it up. Like you can only make a big jump and try to get on the podium if you know it's something that you could actually possibly hit. Otherwise, it's just like you can't even like play that, try to, play that strategic battle at all. Doesn't work that way.
Yeah. At the end of the day, you're limited to, maybe there's a chance that you're overreaching slightly from what you've done in training, but weightlifting is a sport where a lot of athletes are doing more in training than what they're doing in competition. And that changes as you progress in the sport, one way or another. But most athletes fit in a category where they may be doing more in training than they would in competition. And that's for a number of different reasons.
Is it typically a more experienced athlete who has been lifting for like a bunch of years who can like peak on a particular day and like hit a lifetime number? Or what type of athlete like is maybe the personality or has the characteristics that they can go out on the platform and like hit a lifetime PR?
So I think it's highly dependent on personality traits. So, and training age. So personality wise, it takes someone who really is a savage in competition, where that's the setting where they thrive.
Right.
It's the best recipe that you can have, mixed with someone who really, you see it like in the middle ground of the sport. So like early on in those first handful of meets, couple years of development, you can see someone go out there and they're repeatedly hitting lifetime PRs in competition because they have that personality that's there, where it's where they thrive. They love it.
Yeah.
And then in the middle ground, you have that athlete who they have the personality, they've built the confidence, and you start to push more in competition, as opposed to those athletes who are earlier on where they might thrive in it, but it's developmental, right? The goal is 6 for 6. You're just trying to build the total, build the confidence, make lifts. And when you get into the middle ground, you can start to push that a little bit. Gets more tricky the longer the training age that you have and the higher up in the sport you are. Whether that's because of weight classes and things like that, you might train a little heavier and then you're dropping a little bit to go into competition, or it takes a more calculated effort to truly be peaked for competition. Like weightlifters, you're at the higher levels, you're peaking very few times in a year.
Yeah.
And it can be a tall task to really hit that right for a singular event for 6 lifts to go put it together to hit lifetime PRs on a competition floor.
Yeah, it's probably a whole lot easier to do that if you're like, okay, these are our 2 meets in the year. And it's like, we can go through an entire accumulation phase and whatever, blah, 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 peak you down to where you exactly need to be for this competition so that you're in a really good place where if you're going to hit numbers that are, lifetime PRs, you're in a very good place where you could do that. But for most people, like that's not going to happen if you're competing like 6 times a year. It's just not going to happen.
No, if you're new, it's the same thing.
Like, with yeah, right. If you're new, that might happen.
In like CrossFit, like you can have someone who like does Fran and then 3 months later does Fran again and shaves 30 seconds off their time.
Right.
The longer you're training though, like for instance, there's if you have a just ridiculous 2-minute Fran time, like you're probably going to be hard pressed to shave much off that. It's the same in weightlifting. If you've been in the sport 7, 8 years, 9, 10 years, It takes a ton of time. It's not like we can go compete and then we can come back and do an 8-week cycle and go compete again and then PR. It's,
Right.
It's you get to the point where it's 20 plus to year long training plans to be able to put it together in one competition, to even put yourself in a position to take attempts in competition. That would be PRs.
Right. So again, if I compare this to CrossFit, one of the things that I think about when I'm like coaching people is like, if I have someone who's really beginner, I think I can probably improve a lot of their weaknesses or like limiters that we are kind of prioritizing. If they still compete, like maybe 4 times a year or something, like that's totally doable because they can get better at everything because they don't really need to be super specific. But then at a certain point, it's like, if you have like these more glaring weaknesses, like for example, in weightlifting, maybe it's like, man, your back squat is just not high enough for the weights we need you to hit. It's like, you're going to have to take some time away from competing to do that properly. Or it's like, maybe you compete and you just don't peak for it at all. And that's an option too. So I think for maybe that more of a intermediate athlete who, you're not having like 2 events on the calendar where like, we're going to take all of our time and prep for this because they have this huge training age and like, that's like their calendar year for competing or something. But I think like for that kind of intermediate level athlete, having them at least think about competition in a way, it's like, okay, are we actually peaking for this? Or is this just like part of like the training process? Do you have
It's
that
practice.
Right.
Yeah,
Just practice.
It's practice.
How's that conversation go for you with athletes?
Well, so the first thing we do with that is try and iron out what the intent is. Like, why are you doing this? Or is it I like to do this as my mode of exercise? Great. That conversation looks different. Is it, hey, I just want to, go compete at something that is close to or resembles a national level competition? That's a certain conversation. And then if it's I want to compete internationally, that's a totally different conversation. So if you're in that far end category, everything you're doing for a long period of time is essentially practice. For example, I have a girl right now that was on the youth world team, and she's going to be one of the best juniors in the US, and has the potential to go really, really far in the sport on a senior level beyond. Everything we're doing right now it's practice, and she's competing internationally, and it's practice. It's just all development for the things that are really relevant for her when it's time for it to be relevant. So, we had a conversation very early on, and it was just a very clear, if you want this thing, everything else it's developmental, it's practice. And for other athletes who the goal looks differently, what is practice to them or developmental versus time to push looks different. It's just like in CrossFit. If your goal is the open, that's going to look different in what that conversation looks like and how it's approached versus the goal of someone to make it to the games. For the games, for the open, for someone who's trying to get to the games level, they're quarterfinals lock, they're pushing semifinals, whatever that looks like. The open is developmental to them. So it's the same in weightlifting on how that sliding scale looks. And I think a lot of the time in this, that long-term foresight kind of gets lost in the process, especially with younger athletes or people who are earlier on. Everyone wants it now. Everyone wants to qualify for this thing now, or snatch this or clean and jerk this now. But it's at what expense to what you're really trying to accomplish? You find out in the long run.
Yeah. That's super interesting. When I start with athletes, I try to get them wins at the beginning, because that's obviously going to help build their confidence. They're going to have more faith in me as their coach, blah, blah, blah. But for an athlete who's just like GPP, I really try to get them wins up front quickly, because often it's like, if you don't, be very clear with like how they're progressing, they're like way more likely to kind of like fall to the wayside and like kind of get away from training, that sort of thing. If someone comes to me and is like, hey, I want to be an elite level CrossFitter, I'm like, okay, this is the hole that I see. Like, we're going to have to be back squatting three plus times a week for the next 18 months. And then, start to transition into something else. Right. I'm just making that up, but that's sort of like the conversation is completely different depending on what level of athlete you have. And in general, I'm like way harder on people who want to be competitive, because bottom line is, if you want to be better than 99% of the people out there, you have to do something that no one else is really doing when it comes down to it. So yeah, I mean, that's super helpful to think about. Again, for a lot of people listening, they're sort of recreationally competitive. And I think that's probably a lot of people that you work with too, but to be able to kind of look through the BS of what an athlete's saying to you and be able to really like distinguish like, okay, this person actually has the tools. And I think if I could push them, I could get them to a really high level, versus like, you're saying this, but I really see what your priorities are. And, that's fine. And it's all good, but maybe we won't push you super hard. Is there ways that you look at that or think about that as a coach?
Well, I think the principles are the same. Like even if you're recreational, everyone likes to do better. Like it doesn't, you know what I mean? Like,
you want to see progress regardless.
Yeah. No one's going to be like, well, I'm recreational, so I don't want to do it as well as the person who's not. I think it's just the way that you approach the conversations, right? Like if you have someone that it's recreational and it's a kid who's got homecoming, right? Well, that kid who's got homecoming, like in recreational, like, yeah, like go do it, have at it. You know what I mean? The kid who's not recreational has this thing. If everything that they do, not that they shouldn't go to their homecoming, but everything they do is like looked at on how does this impact? So I think it's just the way the mindset is and the conversations. And most of those people that really are driven to do something outside of what is normal usually don't have much of an issue with that mindset of everything else being abnormal. So for the athletes that I've had that have done things to a high degree, it's been very natural for them. It hasn't taken a ton of me being on them. There's simple conversations that we have, but a lot of the stuff is their own decisions and they know what it takes to do it. But I think a lot of it is the same for someone who's recreational versus not. The difference is how they view it in their mind. And what I mean by that is people who have this goal that's just super high achieving, they automatically enter it with a high achieving mindset most of the time. And the people who are recreational to it, they enter it with the mindset of what is needed to do that. So it doesn't, on my end, with my experience in this particularly, it doesn't take a ton. And more times often than not, those athletes who it's still recreational for them, they tend to develop aspects of the mindset of the athletes who it's beyond recreational just because they're around them. It just elevates everybody. And those mindsets kind of start to mesh together, even though for this person, like they weightlift 4 times a week, they go to, maybe it's a local competition, stuff like that, which is awesome. That's the biggest part of what the sport is. It all kind of naturally starts to mesh together. And I think for us, that's just due to the culture of things, not as much me getting in there and being like, well, you need to do this. It's like a natural thing for them. And it's been easy for me, which is cool to see.
Yeah. You don't have to be a wizard in terms of programming if you have a good culture. I mean, I think that's huge. Pretty clear from the number of people who are doing, templated programs and things that are excelling, and maybe it's just because they're really gifted, but it's also like often because they're in like this group of people who's all doing it together and they're like really pushing each other. And if that's the culture that you're in, you're going to progress so much quicker. You know, if your training partner is squatting 405, you're like, ooh, man, I got to get my max up so I can like hang with them, right? You feel like you always are having to push versus if you're the big fish in the little pond, it's pretty easy to get away with a lot more.
Yeah, it's huge.
Cool. I want to switch gears a little bit.
Sure.
Imagine we have an athlete who comes to you and they're relatively new. They're not like they have a big training age or anything. Say they've been going to your CrossFit classes for 2 to 3 years, and you know, so they're consistent, but it's not like they're weightlifting all the time, right? Maybe they get 2 weightlifting touches per week or something in their CrossFit classes of like snatch and clean and jerk. So
yeah,
say they come to you now and they're like, hey, I really just want to, you know, continue to improve, right? They're a little bit more recreational. They still maybe want to compete here and there, but like they just want to continue to progress basically. And this is sort of the next thing for them. Where are you going to take them in terms of frequency of certain movements? So specifically, again, I'm thinking like maybe snatch, clean and jerk, squatting variations. They come to you and they're like maybe in that class setting. Where do you kind of, not maybe like starting like day one, but like within a few months of them training with you, what's that probably going to look like?
Yeah. Is their goal to just continue to improve in CrossFit or in weightlifting?
Good question. Let's say they want to do.
I think those two things look different.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Let's say CrossFit.
Okay. So, from a frequency standpoint, my guess is the first thing I would address is movement, because I think the biggest thing that I see in CrossFitters doing weightlifting, whether that's weightlifting for 1 rep max, coming into weightlifting to compete, or just weightlifting in a Metcon, is there's a huge difference in what those movement patterns look like, because everyone's just really used to the volume in CrossFit in regards to like how they're moving that volume. So like if most of their Metcons, right, for guys are like 95-pound snatches, 135, something like that. It's a lot of barbell cycling that happens. Those movement patterns look drastically different than someone who is trying to snatch the most weight that they possibly can for 1 rep. And I think that the biggest gain that anyone in CrossFit can get in their weightlifting is from trying to weightlift like a weightlifter instead of like a CrossFitter. So, and those two things are different. So looking at those movement patterns and seeing what they're like, for example, when we're barbell cycling, most people's feet are usually grounded. There might be some moving, but usually that movement is backwards as they're cycling. It's not what is most conducive for moving the most amount of weight that they can. So just looking at simple things like that. Are we weightlifting in a way that's conducive to moving the most load that we can, or are we weightlifting in a way that's going to produce the quickest number of reps in a period of time? So I look at that, because usually that's super low hanging fruit that you can address really quickly and see some pretty quick gains. If it's someone who's well-versed in that, where they're snatching well, they understand the difference between snatching for a 1 rep max and snatching for in a Metcon, then the frequency, I think, for what I've seen, works best in people who are trying to compete in CrossFit in some capacity, just trying to improve local competition. They're that person that's in class that cares about the score on the board, is probably like twice a week. But usually the change in frequency comes in the assistance movements for snatch and clean and jerk. So most people who are participating in classes are doing some type of load with squatting once a week, usually. I think most affiliates that I've seen they have some strength day in their programming, and that's usually a back squat or a front squat, something like that. And that's where they're touching it. And you see a lot of CrossFitters who are cleaning loads that are really high from an efficiency standpoint to what they're squatting, or there's someone who is power cleaning something that is really high in efficiency to their full clean. And that's for one of two reasons.
You're going to say my name right now. This is like me exactly.
It's either a strength issue or it's a movement issue. So if we say that their movement, you check that box off and it's good, it's probably just a frequency and strength thing. And the lowest hanging fruit on how to get stronger for most people in this scenario is just increasing the frequency that they're doing the movement. So I like that twice a week for people who are in CrossFit, because there's so much other things you have to concern yourself with. But it's increasing the strength movements. Like most people who are in CrossFit aren't really doing snatch pulls and clean pulls, right? Like they're deadlifting, but they're not doing, it's rare that they're doing like a snatch pull or a clean pull.
Yeah. In class anyway, for sure.
Yeah. Right. Outside of that. Yeah. But if we're talking about the person who's in a class, who they have their hour, maybe they're doing some extra work outside of that hour. It's rare that you're going to see that outside of like a weightlifting class at an affiliate. So it's increasing or adding in frequency in those, as long as the movement patterns are at least intermediate, you can see some pretty good gains just off some squatting frequency, pulling frequency, things like that.
Yeah. So basically, if I'm understanding this correctly, they come to you, you're looking at their movement, seeing how they move, that they're moving well enough where you're like, okay, you understand how to snatch and clean jerk. We can start to load you a little bit. Okay. Do you actually understand how to do this in a maximal strength setting, or in like, to actually develop strength, and that are in the positions that are going to be required for you to lift a new, 1 RM down the road? Or is this something that we need to relearn the pattern? And then if both of those are in check, then it's like, okay, let's just start to get touches on the full movements, maybe twice a week, and add in some accessories that you probably weren't doing before. Is that a fair summation?
Yeah. It's to me, it's kind of like a couple step process. How's the movement? Do we understand the difference between barbell cycling and a 1 rep, and how those should look and feel? And then outside of that, we have our base frequency for we're already doing once or twice a week. And then we're adding in assistance exercises. And to me, assistance exercises are still like back squats and front squats, because for us, it's the snatch and clean jerk, and everything else is in assistance to that. But it's touching on those is where I think you can see a lot of gains, as long as those other 2 steps before it are clear.
Yeah. One of the things that I think most people don't appreciate is strength is a skill. And it's like, if you haven't back squatted for a couple of weeks and you get back under the bar, you might have technically lost some strength qualities, but you probably just aren't super in touch with the movement. And it's just going to feel awkward from a, just a technique perspective, because you haven't been there for a while. Yeah. Jeff Baltimore, your head coach, is, he coached me for quite a while in my weightlifting stuff. And one of the things that he said to me was like, snatching is a skill. It's no different than like throwing a baseball. Like some days you're going to throw it and it's going to, not go where you want it to go, and you're going to miss out in front or something. Right. Like it's really easy for that kind of stuff to happen. So I think just getting into a frequency of some kind that's normal, right? It doesn't have to bury you initially, but getting touches on those more frequently is only going to help you actually learn the movements and develop the positions and the skill and the coordination that you need to be able to express your lifts down the road.
Yeah. Especially as you're newer. I mean, if you're someone who's new, there's no harm in snatching an empty bar every single day. But there's the gain that you get from that alone is incredible when you're new. As you get into it, you got to put a little bit more effort into it than that. But just before a class, like doing 3 sets of 10 of a snatch with an empty bar is huge. Just the frequency of it and touching that movement and refining your motor patterns a little bit at a time over time, just the gains that you can make from that alone go a really long way.
All right, let's take this. Let's say now that we have a higher level athlete, this may be one of the top 5 people that you're working with. What does that frequency look like
for weightlifting?
For weightlifting?
So, usually every single day, we're touching something snatch related, something clean and jerk or jerk related. And then there's usually some type of strength work that's there. And it's really going to depend on where we're at in training. Super phasic in nature. But if most of those people that I have train 5 days a week, I have a couple that do 6 sessions a week. And then during certain times of the year, they'll do more, where we're splitting stuff into 2 sessions. Usually that's during like higher volume stuff where it needs to be. But the frequency relative to our last example is super high. Of those people, let's use someone who's training on that higher end, like that's the 6 sessions. They're snatching in some capacity, probably 5 days, whether that's a full snatch, power snatch, hang snatch, any kind of snatch variation. Another one of those days maybe is a snatch balance. If we're not doing that, that might be that 6 days, something along those lines. Clean and jerks the same way. It's a little bit more stressful on the nervous system. So we'll fluctuate that a little bit more. And we'll isolate the jerk, especially. But there's, again, it's probably 6 days where you're doing something that's developing the clean and jerk. Our strength stuff, I'll give you an example as of now, is for those 6 people are alternating days. So they're doing 3 to 4 squatting sessions a week and then 2 to 3 pulling sessions a week. So there's usually one day where there might be some overlap, but usually those are alternated every other day. But that's going to be super dependent on the person. I've had people that squat 5-6 days in a week, but that's only for short spans of the year. So the frequency for them is high.
Yeah. I mean, that's their sport.
Yeah.
It's like saying like, okay, I have a CrossFit Games level athlete whose swimming is a part of their testing body. We're going to get them swimming once or twice a week in the month leading up to the games. And it's like, okay, obviously swimming isn't as big of a part of CrossFit as weightlifting is, but just use that as your example, right? It's like, compare that to Michael Phelps. He swims every single day. It's like, okay, every once in a while he's not in the pool, but the rest of the time it's like, okay, you got at least one session in the pool every day. And for someone like him, obviously it's way more than that. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, if that's your sport, that's what you're going to be doing. So yeah, I mean, I think that will come to a surprise as a lot of the people listening who especially haven't been, if they're not a higher level athlete or they haven't worked with a coach who's really pushed them before, is just that level of, and that's not a CrossFit athlete, but even for a lot of CrossFit athletes, they might be doing some sort of strength development or weightlifting movement almost every day. And that's, I think, probably pretty standard for a lot of higher level athletes. So, I think that's really helpful context for people listening to be able to start to get a sense of like, this is what people in this sport are doing to develop these qualities. It's really helpful perspective.
Yeah. I mean, it's so like, this is going to sound to people who do CrossFit, like, it's like, so everything in weightlifting is, at least the way we do it, is like incredibly calculated, from a volume and intensity standpoint. Right. So like every single rep that we do is accounted for. And those are fluctuated the same way our intensities are, and when we choose movement selection and all that stuff. And it's all one big puzzle that fits together. So for an example, like we'll base snatch sessions off of doing, if you want to do 8,000 snatches in a year, that's 5 days a week of snatching 30 reps a day. So in a week alone, you might have an upper level and sometimes more. I mean, you have athletes that are doing way more than that, that are snatching 30 reps. And this volume is counted above 60 to 65%. So we're not even counting reps that fall below that. So you'll have metcons where you're doing, 300 reps. So it sounds like it's not a lot, but for if you took someone who's in a CrossFit setting and put them in a weightlifting setting, that would be a ton.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a ton of variation that you see in what that volume looks like, but it's not uncommon to see someone doing 450, 500 reps a week of weightlifting movements that operate in above 60 to 65% range. And most of that volume is fitting between 70 and 80% most times out of the year. So, I mean, that gives you like a kind of a picture of 5 days a week of doing 30 snatches. And if anyone's curious on what that feels like, go do 30 snatches above 60%. Maybe most of that volume is between 70 and 80%. Just imagine doing that 5 days a week and with almost every other movement.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, the only people that are like, that doesn't seem like a lot are the CrossFitters who haven't done a lot of strength work.
Right. Yeah. It sounds like it's not a lot when you have, a Metcon that's like 300 reps in a 12-minute AMRAP, but in weightlifting, that's a lot. That's a good bit.
Especially if you've developed your 1RMs to a decent spot, like then it's like the stronger you get, man, the higher your percentages are. It's like every time someone hits a new PR, I'm like, great, now your working percentages are higher. Like, congrats. Cool. You mentioned pairing things that I thought was really interesting. One of the things that you mentioned was like, for example, if you're doing more of this is my words, but like more of an off season, like, base sort of phase. If you're having higher squat volume, maybe you don't do a ton of clean and jerks as your legs are probably tired and that's more tired, like, draining on the nervous system. So for example, like that might mean that you're pairing more snatches and squats or something. Right. So I have these, I think every coach probably has these biases, like where they're trying to figure out like, what movements pair together well. And then also like preparing the athlete for the sport, what like things that you just feel like work well together. So for like myself, I end up programming like, a lot of like snatches and front squats, for example, or if it's clean jerks, often a lot of back squats afterwards, or like clean jerks into pressing or something. Right. Do you find yourself having those like common things, like I'm alternating squatting and pulling? Like what other things that can you identify as like, patterns that you're seeing in terms of, movement pairings?
So what you said was really interesting because I almost do the opposite at times. So like most of my snatch dominant days, and again, we're doing something snatch related and clean jerk related almost every day, but there's fluctuations on how that'll look, where if let's just take like a singular day, and we have a snatch, a clean and jerk, and a squat. Well, if my snatch is the focus of that day, that's where I'm putting a good bit of my volume and my intensity lays in the snatch. And my clean and jerk is some sort of accessory movement. So it's like a variation, a power, or something like that. On a day like that would be where I'll back squat. So I'd pair together that snatch intensity and the back squat intensity. Mm-hmm. And then the other day would be a snatch variation, and then a clean and jerk focus movement. Again, that's just where it might be a full clean and jerk. So my intensity and volume lays between the snatch and clean and jerk. And then I might have, if I'm squatting again, then I'll front squat. So I pair together clean and jerk focus days and front squat days together, and snatch focus days and back squat days together. Yeah. So slightly opposite of what you just said. But the reason that I do that is usually the back squat is a physically more challenging movement for people, usually. And I have people that never back squat, but for most people, it's hard on the nervous system, what have you. For certain reasons, it's just more challenging on the system than a front squat. So I'll pair the snatch with it because in relation to the snatch and clean and jerk, the snatch is the one that's easier typically on the system. And then I'll pair together the other two because of the likeness of them. That'd be the easy answer to it. really the other is it depends on what the focus is. So we'll go through strength phases where a portion of that strength phase, squatting wise, is focused on developing the back squat. And then it changes to the front squat as we move through that phase. In that scenario, I'd probably change those a little bit depending. But yeah, on a typical training phase for us, like in that middle ground, that's usually how I'm pairing things, like a snatch focus to back squat and then a clean and jerk focus to a front squat.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And I don't think there's probably a right or wrong way to do it, but as long as you have
it's
a
all
good reason.
Yeah, it's however you want to slice and dice it. Yeah.
I mean, this morning I snatched and back squat afterwards. So there you go.
Yeah.
But cool. Where does pooling fit into that? So for me, the way I think about it is like for a lot of people, you know, the snatch is probably often more of the pool in the snatch is more of a limiter for a lot of people than the pool and the clean and jerk. And that maybe that's just my experience with CrossFit athletes. So I often will have them pull. Well, again, it depends if I want them doing snatch pulls or clean pulls as well versus deadlifts, because that's another thing that CrossFitters do that weightlifters basically never do. So where does pooling fit into all that?
Well, it's rare that we deadlift. I will say that.
Yeah.
And if we do, it's like a snatch grip deadlift or a clean grip deadlift. We're usually never doing an alternated grip deadlift. And when we do deadlift, it's like we're in the middle of our prep for Nationals week in Vegas. That's like 16 weeks long. Maybe in the first like 2-3 weeks, we're doing some type of deadlifting. Other than that, it's all pulling. And if I had to choose which pull I would focus on, it's always going to be the snatch pull. So most of our time, effort, and energy is focused on that. We clean pull, but if I have an athlete who we have to prioritize something, I'm always going to prioritize snatch over clean pulls. But and there's individual differences to that. But you're right. It's really most of the time, if one's going to be a limiter from a pulling standpoint, it's going to be snatching. Yeah. Most of the time. Most people fail at clean because they can't stand it up.
Yeah. Or they just didn't extend well because they're trying to get under it.
Yeah. I don't want to say, maybe I shouldn't say they can't because they can't stand it up. It may not be most. There's a huge population where that exists.
Yeah.
But most people can get a bar high enough where they have the force or strength to generate a bar high enough. Maybe they don't have the technical proficiency to do it, but it's usually not what's limiting them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a pretty common experience where if you're going to be limited, one of your two pools is probably more often going to be your snatch pool that you're limited by. Plus for a lot of people who are less familiar, and this isn't, for experienced weightlifters, but for people who are less experienced in weightlifting, there's just a lot more confusion around what is the difference between a clean pull and a deadlift. They just don't understand that. I'm sure a lot of people listening have no clue really the difference. So, I mean, I think that's just one way to make that very clear is like, if you don't prescribe clean pulls and, again, if maybe you're a CrossFit coach, you don't prescribe clean pulls much. There's no confusion there. And it's like snatch pulls its own variation. Maybe you stop at the hip with a little bit of like, staying in a power position or something. You distinguish that some way where it's like, this is a different exercise than this thing over here. And in weightlifting, it's just like, well, you don't deadlift like a power lifter, so you never need to do that. So for your weightlifters, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would guess most of the time you're snatching and then doing clean and jerk variations if you're doing them on the same day, because that's what you're going to do in a meet. And you can give me situations where that might be different. For your CrossFitters, does that matter at all, that order of things?
Not as much for CrossFitters, because a lot of times you see what's becoming more common, like last year's Open, was you see a heavy lift following a Metcon. Or heavy lifting in a Metcon. So there's already the pre-fatigue factor that comes into play there. In weightlifting, most of the time, if you're doing both in the same day, which we don't always do both in the same day, but it's just most of the time we're doing something that relates to the two in the same day. It would be rare that I would have someone clean and jerk before they snatch. I'll have people jerk before that is their first exercise. But, or if I want the if I just am in a situation with an athlete where I want them to have the most amount of energy to clean and jerk, we probably wouldn't snatch that day. That would be a day where we wouldn't snatch.
Yeah.
Or they maybe have some snatch primer where it's really light, some sort of muscle snatch, something like that. But yeah, we just wouldn't. For CrossFit, if I was trying to develop someone who was trying to get better for CrossFit, and weightlifting was a place where they needed the improvement, I would take a similar approach to weightlifting, where if we're doing both in the same day, I'd probably snatch first 99% of the time if we're doing both in the same day. But again, you now have a lot of scenarios where there's either some sort of max complex or something for load at the end of a Metcon, or you're having something where there's work being done and ascending weight on a barbell. So in those scenarios, it would be conducive to train that. And maybe that looks like you're doing squatting first and then your variations, where there's just a pre-fatigue factor that's been placed on it. So you have some resemblance of what that's going to feel like.
For a lot of the people that I work with, it's like, if we're, again, in more like off-season training, basically not prepping for competition, it's like, let the goal be the goal, right? If you're trying to drive up your numbers, there's kind of an ideal structure in how you're going to do your session. And maybe that's often snatch first, then clean and jerk, or have whatever your limiter is, just be the first thing that you do. And then whatever resistance work you want to do after that. But then it's like, as you get closer to competition, you need to prepare for your sport. So if you're weightlifting, you're going to be doing a lot more heavy singles and that sort of thing. If you're preparing for CrossFit, you might have to do a Metcon with clean and jerks and chest to bar, and then build to a max snatch afterwards. Right. So that's not like how you build foundationally quality strength. However, that's how you get tested. So it's what you got to prep for.
Right.
That may be an okay way to think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's really how it works in weightlifting. Like, you far out, you have plenty of situations where you're not doing full snatches and full clean and jerks in the same day. You're doing variations and things like that, but there's a certain level of practice that has to go into it, and conditioning required to be able to snatch heavy and then clean and jerk heavy in the same day. If you're someone who's not used to doing that, or you're not used to touching over 90% in the same day, you will run out of gas in competition. The only time that I rarely see an athlete who just comes in, they're fine with that, is someone who comes from CrossFit, where they just have this ridiculous base to do work. So that task doesn't fatigue them as much as someone who weightlifting is how they got involved in strength sports in general. But yeah, it's the same with CrossFit. You're foundationally building this thing that when it comes time to compete, you're taking that foundation and catapulting it into whatever the competition looks like. It works the same way. It's the same across the board.
Cool. All right. I got one more thing that I want to ask you yet before we close out.
Sure.
So this is about gender differences, and maybe the answer is I don't really think about it a whole lot, because that would probably be the most truthful answer for me. Like, if I'm thinking about my own coaching, it's like I tend to just think about what an individual athlete needs, and then it's just like, maybe they're male, maybe they're female, maybe it doesn't really. Maybe there's other factors that are more important than gender. Is what I'm getting at. So let me just ask the question. Do you think about, male versus female when you're actually doing programming?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, that is usually because there's recovery differences. But that's also dependent on weight class. So like, usually lighter females can recover better, but that's across weight classes. I think the biggest difference that I see across the two genders is guys, most of the time, when they're especially in a train together mindset, where it's a lot of guys that are right. If you tell them to work to a heavy single, right? And heavy single doesn't necessarily mean like maxed out. It's just something heavy on the day, right? Get to something, doesn't got to be a PR. If it feels good, great. They all will max out and miss 19 times in the process. Girls, most of the time, I'm speaking generally here, there's always the change between the two. Girls are like, okay, something heavy on the day, and they push just as hard, but there's not the same like I'm gonna run through a brick wall mindset that when you take like a bunch of guys and put them together, they're just more calculated in how they go about it most of the time. And I'm fine saying that because I'm a guy and I'm the exact same way. Like if I get with Jeff, for instance, and it's like, yeah, we're gonna go to a heavy single and a clean, like, yeah, we're gonna just send it. Girls, I think, seem to be a little bit more calculated in it. And their feedback on how things feel a lot of the times is just more thoughtful on it. I have a kid now who I love him to death. If we went in competition and like he made his second attempt clean and jerk at like 110, so like 240, right? And the most he's ever clean and jerked would be like 250. And you ask him like, hey, you made your first two, like it's up to you. What do you want? He would be like, give me like 280. He's never even pulled 280 off the ground. But and honestly, I'm like, great, let's do it. Yeah. The girls, when you get that equivalent feedback where it's like, let's take this big jump and go for it, you know that they're not just saying it, that they really feel as though they can do it. Most girls like really give you the range that they're like, okay, I just clean and jerked, 185. I'm pretty sure 190 is the limit. So they'll say 190. Whereas a guy would be like, give me 205. That's the biggest difference. And it's all personality stuff, but that's just the biggest stuff that I notice.
Yeah.
Is you put a bunch of guys in a room and they just act like a bunch of guys, but they just want to just hit their head against the wall until it happens.
Yeah. Now I'm imagining everyone listening thinking that like I don't think about gender at all when I'm, because that's what I said. I guess that's maybe not the most accurate way to say it. It's more like I think about, what is your 1RM? If you have a lower 1RM, I can give you more frequent, higher percentage stuff. If you are a smaller individual, if you don't weigh 250 pounds, and you weigh 150 pounds, I can probably give you back squats up to a heavier percentage more frequently, and your knees aren't probably going to feel like trash afterwards.
Yeah. And that stuff, that like, I don't think there's a ton of gender differences. Like, I really don't. Like, from that perspective, an athlete is an athlete, regardless of your gender. And I've seen on both sides things that you would think is this and that, and it's just, it's a person and is an athlete. It's the other stuff that oftentimes comes with personalities. And I think those are just more common personality traits that you see.
Right.
And more than athletic abilities or differences.
Right. Yeah. We're just, we're kind of talking about like commonalities as a whole. Like, okay, women are typically more this way, right? They're typically more estrogenic because there's women that are have like way more testosterone than is like quote normal for a woman. So like maybe they also have a higher body weight and they have more characteristics that are more like a male. So it's like, maybe we need to train them with slightly less volume and, some of those qualities. So it's just like, I feel like, I'm just imagining what people are going to be saying in this conversation, but it's like, okay, you just basically look at what the athlete needs. And part of that is like, okay, what's your personality? What is your gender? Blah, blah, blah. Like all that goes into it as you're making your decisions about their training.
Yeah, 100% does. And I think it's mainly comes down to take all the information that you have on the athlete as an athlete and you make decisions there first. And I think everything that comes after that is as you learn about the person. Like everything that I said was stuff that you just learn about the person. Like it's you can't necessarily take any athlete and take anything outside of the data that you have on them, and make any decision on them until you've spent a period of time with them. And you just start to learn how they're like as an individual. Are they that person that is super internally motivated? Are they externally motivated? Do they, when they get in a room with a bunch of people, do they just lose their minds every single time? Are they more reserved in that? Like, how does that look for them? And I think you see gender commonalities in that sense, but from the, like any other sense, is usually the same. If what they need is what they need. And I've seen volumes look very similar or drastically different. I've seen their ability to recover look very similar, drastically different. And I've seen personality traits on both sides that are very similar. But generally speaking, you have some differences, and it's just recognizing those differences, but you can't necessarily make a generalization off of it until you really get into the thick of things with them, because it's just so hard to know who the person is standing in front of you.
I love it. All right, final question. So we've got someone who, let's say they're starting with you and you're, getting into coaching them. Say they're relatively new, maybe a couple weeks, or maybe not even that long, maybe a couple days that you're actually been working with them, and you're starting to figure out, like, what is this athlete like, the qualities of them, the personality traits, like all the stuff we were just talking about, right? Is there any like qualities that are sort of like intangibles or personality traits or even behaviors that if you're like, if I see this, I know that this person's going to be like, have way more potential to get really good?
Yeah, it's just really hard to describe. So in my experience of all the athletes that I've worked with that end up really excelling, they are incredibly internally motivated. Like, it doesn't matter. They don't care much about the external praise that comes with it. They have this drive that where it comes from, I have no idea. Like, if it's on the program, they'll make it. They'll find a way to make it every single time. And it's very rare that they'll either not do something or need to alter something. It's just rare to do that. A good example is, there's a lot of them in here. A good example is the girl, Miranda Olroy, who has competed internationally and stuff like that. Like, she has trained for over 2 years and she's never missed a training session. And never once have I ever needed to be like, hey, are you coming tomorrow? She just shows up and does it. I think there's a big part of it is a maturity level for a lot of people, and the ability to do things that are required to do and make the sacrifices that are required for whatever they're trying to do. And it's really hard to describe that. Like, I don't know if I have a very good answer for you, but there's just, it's kind of a corny term. They're just some athletes that are just built different in a sense with what those traits look like. With that being said, I think any individual can learn and develop themselves in their athletic ability and in their mentality and maturity and personality to achieve really, really high. And I think most people in sport, whether it's CrossFit or weightlifting, neglect everything that happens outside of the gym, like the mental game. That is really what I'm getting at. And it can be developed, like just like your strength qualities or your speed qualities, like it can be developed. We have a sports psychologist that works with people on our team, because the better that you can become at that, you can learn those qualities that we're referring to. And I think even for athletes who aren't predisposed to just naturally being able to hop in something and excel, that's an area that they can find a way to make up for that, and do far better than athletes who have every physical gift, but struggle in that area or haven't just addressed it yet. So I just went on a whole circle there. It's really hard to answer the question of like, this is the quality that it takes. But yeah, I've seen athletes who just come in and they're just built different and they have it and they just crush everything. And I've seen athletes who over years have developed themselves to be able to do that. So I'm not sure there's certainly physical traits, but like personality traits or things like that. I think that can be developed just like your every other quality of sport.
Yeah, I mean, showing up every day and doing what's written, you're gonna get way further than almost everyone else out there.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. 100%.
Hey, let's leave it there. I'd love to have another conversation at some point down the road, but let's put a little cap on it there. I appreciate it a lot, though. Thanks for jumping on today, man.
Absolutely, man. Yeah, for sure.
Hey, it's Ben again. Thanks for listening today. To be completely honest, it's been really rewarding to have people who listen to the show regularly reach out to me, whether they have a question about training or just to say hey. So if you haven't done that yet, do it. I'm pretty good about getting back to people, and you can feel free to email me, ben@zorfitness.com, or message me on Instagram @zorfitness. And graciously, I've had some people reach out to me and ask how they can support the show. Number one way that you can support the show if you are a regular listener is just by rating the show. Most apps have a platform where you can actually rate it, and on Apple Podcasts, you can write a review as well. This is super helpful in having other coaches and athletes find the podcast, but also just having it grow and for me to continue to want to put out more and more content. Also, I'm going to be posting more full episodes of the Fitness Movement to our YouTube channel. So if you're someone who actually enjoys seeing my face when I talk, you can head over to YouTube and subscribe if you please. And if you're someone who is watching on YouTube, you have the ability to like our videos, but then you can also comment on the video if you have questions about the episode or if you want to suggest a topic for a future episode. And lastly, if you're someone who really does value what we're putting out, I would encourage you to hire a coach. For me, coaching is the bulk of my job, and it's what I believe I do best. So if you're an athlete or a coach looking to up your fitness game, be sure to reach out. You can message me on Instagram @ZorFitness or email me ben@zorfitness.com. Thanks again for listening today. And as always, stay the course.